So the topic of my talk is hope, hopeless, question mark. And people have already said, is it going to be yes or no? But as other people have said, this is a philosophy talk. So, there's not going to be a straightforward answer. You can tell me what you think at the end. But in a way, I suppose I should begin with a little confession, as we're sort of in church, that although I organised this event along with Keith Farrow, I'm not actually a religious person, in the sense I don't think I believe in anything that traditional religions believe in, but I am very interested in religion as such, as a kind of phenomenon, as a piece of our culture, our thinking, our history, and so on. And I'm particularly interested, in my recent work at least, on the connection between ethics and religion, and how one depends on the other. I guess we're all familiar with this quote, not from Dostoevsky himself, but from one of his characters, Ivan Karamazov, "Without God, all things are permitted." So that's a particular view of the relationship between ethics and religion, which suggests that if you get rid of religion, you get rid of ethics entirely. And that's obviously a pretty bleak view. If that's right, and if we decide that God doesn't exist, then if ethics goes entirely, there's not much left. But I think that's probably too extreme a view. A slightly more moderate view, which is what I want to explore in this talk, is that certain concepts or ideas that are fundamental to ethics make less sense or become harder to understand without religion, because, in a way, for the simple reason that until very recently, most human culture was religious in one form or another. And when I say very recently, I mean, in a way, the last 50 years or so, in some sense. And so it would be sort of surprising if ethical concepts and religious concepts weren't deeply bound up with one another. And it would therefore be surprising that if you take religion out of the equation, that doesn't make any difference to our ethical thinking. And one person who has made a very interesting discussion of this is somebody called Elizabeth Anscombe, an English philosopher, sort of mid-20th century. And Anscombe wrote about the idea of moral obligation, which is something that I'm interested in, and argued that ultimately moral obligation may not make much sense unless you believe in God. She did believe in God. She was a pretty devout Catholic, but again, she thought sort of culturally, if we've lost the idea of God, then the very idea of moral obligation, that there's certain things you must do, doesn't really make any sense anymore. So here's a passage from Anscombe. This is relatively long. There aren't many long passages, but I did think it was worth just quoting this. And this is Anscombe herself on the right, looking fairly grumpy and formidable. Naturally, she says, it is not possible to have such a law conception, so the idea that there are things you must do, unless you believe in God as a lawgiver, like Jews, Stoics, and Christians. But if such a conception is dominant for many centuries and then is given up, it is a natural result that the concepts of obligation, of being bound or required as by law, should remain, though they have lost their root. And if the word ought has become invested in certain contexts with the sense of obligation, it too will remain to be spoken with a special emphasis and a special feeling in these contexts. And then she goes on to say, it is as if the notion criminal were to remain when criminal law and criminal courts have been abolished and forgotten. So she's imagining it's like a world where people wander around talking about criminals, but there's no actual courts to enforce anything. There's no police to catch criminals. It's just a sort of term that's left hanging around, but without any real meaning or sense. And then she concludes the notion of moral obligation, the moral ought and duty, are best put on the index, which she means in the Catholic sense of sort of forbidden, ruled out, if a person can manage it. So her thought is it's actually rather hard for us to get away from the notion of moral obligation because this is a sort of hangover from a certain way of thinking. But if we thought it through, we'd begin to see it doesn't really make much sense. And if we can, we might do better to just give it up. So obviously that's a particular example of a close connection she's drawing between a moral concept of obligation and a religious structure that makes sense of it for us. So what I want to do today is a sort of similar kind of exercise, but thinking instead about moral obligation, thinking about hope as a concept. So again, the question is, broadly, if we take that notion and look at its theological background, and then think, well, what would it be like if that theological background were taken away? What would we be left with? And would we be left with something that makes sense anymore? So hope is a topic that has a long history of discussion. Again, particularly initially within the church. So certain key theologians talk a good deal about hope. St. Paul, Augustine and Aquinas, and then contemporary theologians, Tillich and Moltmann. But also philosophers have talked a fair bit about hope in one way or another. For example, Spinoza, Kant, Peirce, Bloch, who a sort of Marxist philosopher, Marcel, and a Danish philosopher I'm interested in called Løgstrup. These people all talk about hope in various ways and have interesting things to say about it. And then a number of contemporary philosophers, which I've listed there, have interesting things to say about hope, particularly Jonathan Lear, who I might talk about in Q&A, but I won't say much more about here. So there's a whole sort of tradition of thinking about this. And what I want to do into this talk is just to introduce the theological conception of hope, and then consider what we might need to change if we remove, as it were, the theological background and replace it with something more secular, and then consider whether what we end up with is a coherent notion, or, as Anscombe says a bit about moral obligation, we're left with something that sort of is hanging around in the air but doesn't really make much sense anymore. So just to say something about theological hope, hope in the theological tradition, I mean, one of the key thinkers on this issue is Aquinas. And Aquinas, following others, thinks of hope as a theological virtue alongside, of course, faith and love. And these are distinguished from the cardinal virtues, such as prudence, justice, courage, and temperance. So what does that distinction mean? What does it mean to call something a theological virtue as opposed to a cardinal virtue? Well, first of all, it's a virtue. That's one side of it. And one way of thinking about this, a fairly sort of standard view in a way, is to think of Aquinas as trying to combine Aristotelian thinking on the one hand with Christianity on the other. That's his sort of place, if you like, in the history of ideas. And virtues were central to Greek ethics, and in particular to Aristotle's ethics. And the way that Aristotle understood them is as excellencies of character that enable individuals who have them to lead a good life, both for themselves, as it were, and collectively. So, and also, as you'll probably know, these virtues are understood as lying somewhere between two vices. So this is the Aristotelian idea of forming some sort of golden mean. So one example to think of is courage. So if you possess the virtue of courage, that's both good for you, because if you're a kind of timid, scaredy cat, that's not a great life to lead. You'll spend all your time neurotically fearing the worst. On the other hand, if you're some kind of psychopath who just doesn't feel courage in the right way, but is just prepared to risk everything, that's also not going to be good for you. So courage is somewhere in the middle between these two vices. And it will be good for you, but also good for the community of which you are part. Because if you're courageous, you will know how to act appropriately within the community in such a way that benefits both you and the community. So that would be an example of a sort of Aristotelian way about thinking about virtues in general. And as a virtue, it's different from a desire or an emotion. So if you think about the virtue of courage, it's not just reducible to a desire for stuff, and it's not just reducible to a feeling, although it has in some sense aspects of both. And nor is it reducible to just a belief. I mean, to have courage, you might be prone to having certain beliefs, but it's not just in itself a belief. So it has an interesting kind of structure as a virtue, or virtues in general do. And another key feature of them, which will be important as we go on, is that virtues can be learnt. They can be acquired, and they can be learnt through upbringing. So any of you who have children might realize that you spend an awful lot of your time trying to inculcate virtues in your children. So encouraging virtues of courage, temperance, and so on. These are things that this is part of the sort of communal structure, if you like, of the notion of virtues, that we spend our time trying to encourage others to acquire them, again, both for themselves and for the community. But interestingly, hope, the one we're talking about, is not included in the Aristotelian list of virtues. It's not clear that Aristotle would have thought hope is a very good thing, for reasons we'll come on to. Hope is not in his list of the kinds of capacities that an Athenian gentleman, mostly, is what he had in mind, might need to lead a good life. Hope isn't really needed if we think of Aristotle. But that's what it might be to be a virtue. What is it to be a theological virtue? For example, faith, hope, and love. What makes them theological virtues? And there are three features that are usually identified as making them theological. The three features are, first of all, their object, namely what you're hoping for. And what makes them theological is that what you're hoping for, in some sense, is directed towards God. So the object of your hope is God. Secondly, the ground of the hope, so the reason why you hope, is based on a belief in God. And finally, the source of hope, how you acquire the hope, is infused by God. And these three virtues, faith, hope, and love, are meant to be deeply interconnected with one another, just as Aristotle thought his virtues were deeply interconnected with one another. So if you don't have one, you won't have the rest. But obviously I'm not going to talk about all three. I'm just going to focus on hope, although the others will come into play at certain points. So hopefully you can see how the idea of the theological virtues is both a kind of development from, but an addition to the Aristotelian way of thinking about these things. So let me say a little bit more about those three dimensions of theological virtue. So first of all, the object of hope. On this picture, God is the object of hope, as I said, and what you hope for, at least according to Aquinas, is that God will lead us to eternal blessedness or beatitude. That's what you're hoping for. But why talk about hope in this context? Why is hope the appropriate attitude? I think for two key reasons. First of all, it's beyond your power. So hope is really only appropriate when it's something that you can't bring about for yourself. So if I say to a student, "Are you bringing me your essay tomorrow?" and they say, "I hope so," that either suggests that there's something, really getting in their way, or they don't get it, and what they should say is, "Yes, I expect to," or something, right? So if you say hope, it's something that isn't in your control. That's what it seems to imply. And of course, that's why it's appropriate to feel hope towards God, because God is not something under your control, as opposed to doing your homework, which hopefully is under your control. And secondly, again, you can't be sure that it's going to happen. If you know for sure something is going to happen, then again, it isn't appropriate to hope for it. Again, it would be odd to say, "I hope the sun will rise tomorrow." I mean, that suggests there's some uncertainty about it, right? There's a meteor in the vicinity or something. But if everything is normal, then that's a bit of an odd thing to say. Whereas, of course, if you're thinking about God, you don't know kind of what he's up to, and so hope is an appropriate attitude. But on the other hand, why not feel despair? I mean, you might think, well, look, this is not in my control, and I don't know if it's going to happen. So why hope rather than despair? Or why not have belief somehow in proportion to the probability, something like a reasonable expectation? Well, that's because the reason not to despair is because God is the ground of hope. So the reason for hope is God. And because God is the ground of hope, that's why it's appropriate to feel hope rather than despair, because after all, God in some way or other is working towards the good. You may not know fully how and exactly how it's going to play out, but if it was the devil, as it were, in charge here, then despair would certainly be appropriate. But if it's God, you've got some ground for hope. But you can't have knowledge or some reasonable expectation about what is going to happen, because belief in God itself is a matter of faith. So if belief in God was somehow pretty tied down and determinate, then you could just have beliefs about the good things that are going to happen. But because belief in God itself is a matter of faith, then that too isn't appropriate to have just belief about what is going to occur. So faith, as it were, is not a fully rational element, but given faith, then hope is rational. Right? So, as it were, the irrational bit, if you want to put it that way, lies in faith, but then given faith, it is rational to hope rather than to despair. And then finally, the third feature is the idea of God as the source of hope. And here the difference is between the theological view and the Aristotelian view. Remember, the Aristotelian view was that, broadly speaking, you could develop virtue, at least given some help by your local community, by your parents, or by others around you. So you can be taught the virtues of courage, and you can develop the virtue of courage for yourself. You can, decide, look, I'm a bit of a wimp, and I'm going to take steps to make myself more courageous by doing things, right? You're going to take up some scary sport or whatever it is, and you're hoping that that will make you more courageous and less of a wimp, right? And this is something you can do for yourself. The difference here is that hope is, as it's put, an infused virtue. So you can't do really much or anything to acquire it. It's given to you by God in grace. That's what God's grace is doing here, as it were. And because it's given to you by God, you can't claim credit for having it. Now, we could get into this in the Q&A, but one crucial difference between the Catholic tradition here and the Lutheran tradition is, can you perhaps claim a little bit of credit, even though it's an infused virtue, which is roughly the Catholic view, or can you claim absolutely no credit because it's an entirely infused virtue, which is more the Lutheran view. But either way, both traditions, to some degree, make it something that you cannot bring about, at least wholly, by yourself. So this is from Aquinas. A virtue is a good quality of the mind by which one lives righteously, of which no one can make bad use, and which God works in us without us. Whether it's the without us is the key bit. And that's why the source of the virtue is not yourself, your own efforts, it's not the human community, it's God. Okay, so hopefully that gives you a sense of what the theological picture roughly, I mean I'm simplifying, but roughly looks like. So now I want to start moving to a more secular way of thinking about these things. And again, where the question I have in mind is, if you move to the more secular position, can you make sense of hope in some other way and it's all fine? Or do you end up with a rather incoherent notion that turns out to be really dependent on this sort of theological background that, increasingly, I suppose, is disappearing or has indeed disappeared? So one thought you might have might be, well, look, if we're not concerned about our relation to God, if we're moving to a secular picture, and if all this stuff is about our relation to God in the theological notion of hope, you might think, well, one option is just to give up on it altogether. You know, as I said, Aristotle doesn't have the notion of hope as a virtue. Maybe it had a home in Christian thinking, but maybe we don't need it anymore. Maybe we could just forget it. But the trouble is, as Peter Geach, one of the more contemporary writers, says about this, that from the virtue perspective, it's tempting or appealing to think we need something like this notion, because just as we can think courage serves a really important role in our lives in various ways, so you might think hope needs to serve an important role in our lives, regardless of whether or not it leads us to some relation to God. So this is from Geach. It is easy to explain what role the virtue of hope may have. If attainment of man's chief end is possible, but arduously difficult, we need a virtue that preserves us alike from a fatuous presumption that blinds us to the difficulties and dangers of the path. So that would be, as it were, the vice of just easy optimism, who just, the kind of person who just thinks, there's no problem here, just get on with it, right? That's not necessarily the appropriate attitude in all cases. But the other side is despair that would make us give up, lie down, and miserably perish, which would be a kind of faint-heartedness. So given that life, isn't a bed of roses, as it were, given that life just isn't incredibly easy, it does seem to make sense structurally that we have a kind of attitude that will buoy us up when things get hard, but also not lead us into facile kind of optimism. So something like this virtue looks like it might be a good thing to have. So then the question is, well, can we have it, or can we make sense of it without the theological background? Can we make sense of the idea of secular hope as a virtue? And here we have, I think, somebody who was presenting us secular hope. Well, in a way, I think one way of answering or thinking about that question is to take the three elements of the theological virtue that I mentioned and just think, well, what would they look like in a more secularized form? And would they make sense in a more secularized form? Where, remember, the three dimensions were the object of hope, what it is we hope for, the ground of hope, what our hope is based on, and what the source of hope is. How do you acquire hope? So let's start with the first one, the object of hope. So remember why Aquinas treated hope as appropriate to eternal blessedness. There were two reasons. First of all, it's beyond your power to achieve eternal blessedness. That's why you need hope. You can't just get it for yourself easily. And secondly, you can't be sure that you'll get it. If you knew it was coming, or even if you knew to what probability it's going to come, then you don't need hope. You need either knowledge or belief that it's going to happen. So what we need, if we're going to kind of secularize this picture, is a secular equivalent of that. A secular equivalent of something like eternal blessedness, which obviously isn't a secular idea, as the object of hope. And you might think, well, yeah, that's not a problem. I mean, there's tons of stuff that's beyond my power to achieve, and I can't be sure or even assign a probability of achieving it. For example, I might hope for world peace, right? Well, I can't bring about world peace, so it's certainly beyond my power to achieve it, and I can't really be sure. I mean, if somebody said, well, what's the probability of world peace? I don't know. You know, it's so complicated, it's such a tricky idea that I can't form a sort of belief about it in a very thought-through way. And so you might think hope is an appropriate attitude there. And that's obviously a perfectly secular object, world peace. We're not talking about eternal blessedness, we're just talking about a reasonably peaceful world. Well, I could have hope towards that. Similarly, and this is something that some of the philosophers that I mentioned briefly at the beginning, people like Peirce talk about, and Kant, they talk about hope in relation to scientific inquiry. So you might think, well, what science is aiming for is a complete understanding of the universe, say. Well, obviously that's beyond my capacities to achieve, sadly, right? But also, again, I can't assign some sort of probability to us achieving that knowledge. So it's not something that I can sort of form sensible beliefs about, that I'm going to attain, that I'm going to attain this knowledge. So again, you might think, well, that appropriately fits an attitude of hope. So we might say, I hope that world peace will come about. I hope that science will achieve an understanding of everything in the universe, right? So that seems to make perfect sense within a secular context. You don't need eternal blessedness as the object of hope. But of course, what we're talking about here is individual hope, hope that I might have or you might have here and now. But what about, as it were, collective hope, if you think there is such a thing, i.e. a kind of hope that we as a community have? Does that make sense within this secular picture? Does it make sense for us as a community, for example, to hope for world peace or hope for the end of science, science achieving complete knowledge of the world? Well, I said before that hope only makes sense if it's somehow beyond our power to achieve it. Now, obviously, world peace is beyond my power, and the end of science is beyond my power, but it looks as if we're going to say that these things are object of collective hope, that these things are beyond each of our powers as individuals or as a community. That is, we must, I think that whether or not we achieve it is some kind of, for example, force of history that's not entirely under our control. Because if it is under our control, then it looks like hope is not the right attitude, right? We said earlier that to say, I hope I'm going to submit my homework, implies that it's not entirely under your control to submit your homework. Similarly, if we say, I hope that world peace will come about, if we say we hope that world peace will come about, that implies that whether or not world peace happens is not something within our control. Now, of course, some people have thought that. They've thought that there's a kind of way in which history is unfolding that isn't actually something we somehow can control. But of course, you might think that when you do that, and you introduce that idea, you are starting to introduce something rather God-like. Of course, you might think it's not God, but it's beginning to take on rather divine powers. Namely, there's something that controls history of a benign kind that, if things work out, will end well for us. Well, that is, in a way, to make a kind of force guide the world that is beginning to look rather semi-theological, at least. Right? So we started looking for something secular, and we've ended up with something semi-secular, shall we say. It's not quite clear that this is a fully secularized notion. So that was the object of hope. Now think about the second dimension of hope that I talked about, which is the ground of hope. So the ground of hope is what is the basis for hope, right? Why do we hope? On the theological view, the basis of hope, as I said, is faith in God. And that makes the hope rational, right? I mean, the faith bit is maybe not so rational, but given faith, hope is a sensible attitude to have, right? If through faith you believe in God, then having hope is perfectly sensible, right? There's nothing irrational about hope under those conditions. And that suggests that for hope to be rational, the ground of hope has to be sufficient to make it possible that what you're hoping for will be attained. Right? You've got to have enough sort of oomph in the ground of hope to make what you're hoping for realizable. And so you need the right relation between the object of hope on the one hand, what you're hoping for, and the ground of hope, the basis for hope, on the other. If they're not, as it were, in sync, then the hope is going to look irrational in some way. So, if the ground of hope is this guy on the right, okay, then to be rational, you shouldn't hope for very much, right? Because you're not going to get it. Now, you might think this is also a bit of a problem for the secularist view. Because for the religious person, the ground of hope, as I've said, is God. And of course, if your ground of hope is God, the object of hope can be something pretty ambitious, like eternal blessedness or world peace or something really big, right? Because, of course, the ground of hope is really big, as it were. But for a secular person, without God as the ground of hope, and without, say, some attribution of sort of forces to history that are quasi-divine, for example, it looks like you're going to have to scale down the object of hope in some way. But the problem then is, if you scale it down enough, it's not clear that it's really an object of hope anymore. Rather, it's just an object of belief or reasonable expectation. So hope kind of drops out of the picture. So let me try and illustrate that with an example. Suppose you're a commuter and you get on your train to London and you say to your sort of fellow sufferer next to you, passenger, fellow commuter, you say, I hope this train gets me to London on time. So what's your ground of hope? Well, your ground of hope is East Midlands trains. Now, given that the ground of hope is East Midlands trains, you might think, well, why did you say hope, right? I mean, why didn't you say, well, I'm pretty sure I'll get to London on time, but I'm not certain. I mean, you're definitely not certain you'll get to London on time, right? That would be a kind of miracle. But you might think, well, given the number of trains I've taken and so on, I think it's, 50% chance I'll get to London on time. Why are you hoping anything? I mean, in fact, you don't really need hope here. I mean, hope is a silly thing to say because you've got to, you're not a kind of trained guard, right? You don't have complete knowledge. But you've got a pretty good understanding of trains and how they work and the system and so on. So why don't you just say, well, I'm reasonably confident I'll get there today, but who knows, all right? Why do you say hope at all? Hope seems the wrong attitude, because remember, if we're thinking about it in the theological context, the reason to say hope was you didn't really know. I mean, it's all in God's hands, right? But East Midlands trains is not like God, right? I mean, you can have some insight and understanding of how they work, right? So why do we have hope here at all? So you might think you've got a kind of dilemma here for the secularist. You can give up God as the ground of hope, but then you reduce the object of hope, and then you don't really need hope anymore. You can just start to form beliefs. You don't need hope. Or you can make the object of hope more ambitious, so you really do need hope, but then you need something godlike as the ground. You need something pretty special to be the ground of hope. I think that's an interesting question. Or at least I persuaded myself it is. You can tell me if it isn't later. But there is one way of replying, which I think is worth thinking about. And one response to this dilemma is to say, well, no, there's another way in which hope could come into this picture. The way I've been using up to now is thinking of hope as something relatively close to what us philosophers call theoretical reason, where theoretical reason goes around trying to work out how things are in the world. The contrast to that is practical reason, whereas practical reason is thinking about what do I do to change the world. Now, one way of making hope rational, even if the grounds for expectation are low, is if having the hope brings significant practical benefits. So what you're doing in a way is moving from theoretical here to practical reason. You're thinking, if having the hope will lead me to do things or achieve things that I wouldn't otherwise do without the hope, that's another reason to have the hope. And you might think that the problem I've just suggested only really arises if we're talking about the more theoretical reason. If we move to practical reason, you might think, well, look, it's just the benefits of having the hope that make it rational to feel hopeful, not the grounds for the hope at all. It's what will the hope enable me to achieve that makes the hope rational, not on what basis do I hope? I.e., have I got some mechanism by which this might come about? And this is a pretty familiar phenomenon, right? Fairly familiar aspect of the nature of hope. For example, there's a lot of evidence, it's the placebo effect in one form or another. By hoping you'll get better, there's more chance that you will. Right? If you despair, you're very likely to get less well than if you hope you're going to get better. And you might think, well, if we hope that world peace will be achieved, it's more likely it will. Right? We'll be more energized to do something about it. We'll be less put off when things go wrong, and so on and so forth. And similarly, in the science case, by hoping that we can understand the world, we're more likely to end up understanding it, because we won't just despair and give up our experiments, we'll keep on trying and so on. So then you might ask, well, what makes hope in these circumstances rational? It's not the ground of hope. It's not what makes you think the hope is going to be achieved, right? It's if by hoping, am I more or less likely to achieve certain ends that I'm interested in? So the ground of hope here is not theoretical reason, but practical reason. So if hoping in world peace makes world peace more likely, that looks like a perfectly rational basis for hope based in practical reason. And the dilemma I had before, which is essentially a dilemma about theoretical reason, what is the ground of hope, just would drop away. However, it still seems to me it might be the case that there's a problem for the secular position. So think of two people who are ill, one of whom is religious and one of whom is secular. The religious person might think something like this: I hope I will get better because I have faith that my life is in the control of a benign power. Right? So they have hope, but it's grounded in something like a theological belief. Now think of the secular person that I was characterizing just before. We're imagining that they say, well, I hope I will get better because by so hoping, the reason I hope is that by doing that, I think I'll increase the chances I will get better. Now the question is this one really a case of hope, of really hoping you will get better, or just forming a belief that you will for instrumental or practical reasons? Are you really hoping, or are you just forming the belief that you're going to get better, but not on theoretical grounds, but because having that belief will make it more likely that you will? But then it's not hope, because the ground of the belief is its practical consequences rather than anything like faith. So again, my thought is that the issue of the ground of hope, this second feature that we've been discussing, is again perhaps still a problem for the secular point of view. If the secular hope comes through theoretical reason, it looks like your hopes will have to be pretty modest, because the grounds will be pretty modest. Or if it comes through practical reason, you don't really end up with hope, you end up with belief. And William James, who's known as one of the people who argues this practical point, I think it's no coincidence that the key essay in which he argues this is the will to believe. He doesn't talk about hope, he talks about belief. You form the belief in yourself in order to achieve a certain end. You don't really form a hope. So one of his key examples is, imagine you're at the edge of a sort of precipice and there's, I don't know, some kind of landslide behind you and you've got to make the jump, and you're thinking, God, I can't make that jump, it's too far. And then you think, yeah, but if I believed I could, maybe that would be enough to give me the kind of adrenaline rush that I need to get across. So what you do is form the belief that I can jump. You don't form a hope. Okay, nearly there. If you're beginning to despair, give up hope. This is the last bit, the third feature of hope. This is the stuff about the source of hope. Remember, we said on the Aristotelian view, hope is something that you can, virtues are things that you can instill in yourself to some degree. But on the religious view, hope is an infused virtue, one we can't cultivate for ourselves. But I didn't really explain much why you might think that, or why it is important to our conception of hope. Why not think of hope like anything else. All the other virtues are something you can kind of work on, right? So just as you can work on your courage by going on scary holidays and sort of beefing yourself up, why can't you do something to increase your hope or hopefulness as you can with the other cardinal virtues? Why does Aquinas and Luther and all the others insist that hope has to be an infused virtue? Well, one argument, if from a theological perspective, is that hope requires, as we've said, faith in God as the ground of hope, and you can't have faith unaided. Faith, because faith goes against reason in some sense, the only way to acquire faith is through God's intervention, if you like. And if faith is something infused, and faith is required for hope, then hope is going to be something infused too. But we've said, although we left it rather inconclusive, but we said at least the secularists might try and find other grounds for hope, grounds that aren't God, and in which case, if that's right, then you can't connect God to faith and faith to hope. You can find some other ground for faith, a secular kind, and then you would lose this argument for for hope being infused. So is there another argument for why hope is an infused virtue? Well, here's another argument which you sort of find in a way, I think, in some of the theological literature. An important human vice is arrogance and lack of humility. If you think that you can acquire all the virtues for yourself, you will lack humility. So you need to think that these virtues, including hope, arise without one's control. So you need to think of them as infused by God. Right? This, in a way, is drawing out one of the implications of the unity of the virtues. That if we think arrogance is a vice, then one way of acquiring that kind of arrogance is thinking you can do everything for yourself. And so if you think the virtues are something you can acquire by yourself, you will generate the vice of arrogance, and that will, if you like, corrupt all the other virtues, including hope. So you might think it's important to us that we recognize that we can't acquire these virtues through our own efforts. Otherwise, we're going to end up the kind of arrogant people that don't have any virtues, including the virtue of hope. Well, again, I think there's some force in that argument, but you might respond by saying, well, sure, we don't want to be arrogant, and if we're arrogant, we are likely to lack many of the virtues. But still, you could think, well, you know, I could think I can do something for myself without becoming an arrogant lunatic, right? I mean, you know, I think I can read by myself, but that doesn't turn me into a sort of overweening, arrogant fool. And similarly, you might think you can acquire some of the virtues by yourself without letting it go to your head, as it were. So, again, while there might be some force in this worry, perhaps it's not conclusive. So you might think, as I say, that there's nothing, although Aristotle himself doesn't have hope as one of his virtues, you could reasonably fit hope within the Aristotelian scheme and think that, like the other virtues, it's something that can be acquired. But here's another interesting feature of hope that has been pointed out by other people that I think might be relevant here. And the feature is being called, in the discussion of this, mediopassivity. And that term, I think, comes from Greek grammar, about which I know nothing whatsoever. But I'm told that in Greek you can sort of say things that are both active and passive at the same time. If anyone knows how to say that, feel free to tell us afterwards, right? And that's therefore being used as a label for certain kind of phenomena where you can't really achieve them through an act of will, but you have to sort of surrender yourself to them. So it's not entirely passive because you give yourself up to them, but it's not entirely active either because you have to give yourself up. So a simple example, which is kind of dear to my heart because I'm a bit of an insomniac, so when I'm an insomniac I ponder, in the middle of the night, the fundamental features of insomnia. And one phenomena that has this medio-passive aspect, I think, is sleep, right? So as anyone who has trouble sleeping will know, the more you try and sleep, the worse it gets, right? You're never going to go to sleep if you're sitting there thinking, I must go to sleep, right? So you somehow have to give yourself up to sleep, as we say, a bit poetically, but I think kind of accurately. You have to sort of let yourself go into sleep. So it's not entirely passive, right? Because when I wake up in the morning, I think, oh, God, well done, You feel you've somehow achieved something, but of course you haven't done anything really active. You've just let sleep come to you. But that's something, right? So it's both active and passive in some way. Another example, perhaps a bit more serious, is love, right? So again, you can't will yourself to love someone. If you do, if you find yourself in that situation, chances are, forget it, right? It's not going to happen. But on the other hand, love isn't, contrary to, some of the pop songs, it isn't just something that hits you over the head. I mean, there's some element of activity involved in love, but it's not the same activity as going for a walk or something, right? And similarly, I think people think of prayer as somewhat like this, right? So again, prayer can't be something where you're sort of there demanding, do this, that, and the other for me, right? You've sort of got to give yourself up to something, but there is an element of activity to it as well. Well, arguably, hope is a bit like this, I think. And I think you can sort of see why. Because if you try to make yourself hope, then I think you'll realize all the problems that lie in your way, right? I mean, if you think, I better hope I'm going to get to the airport, well, that means that the chances are you're not going to get to the airport, right? I mean, you wouldn't need hope if there was a reasonable chance and it was all going reasonably well. You just think, I'm going to get to the airport, right? So as soon as you start hoping, things have probably gone wrong, right? But of course, as soon as you realize that, you'll stop hoping. You'll start despairing. So hope has this same seems to me anyway, it has this same medio-passive structure. You can't instill hope in yourself, but on the other hand, it is something that has some element of activity as well. So if a cardinal virtue is something that you can just go around instilling on yourself wholly actively, then hope doesn't look like that. And so it's reasonable to draw a distinction between hope on the one hand and the other cardinal virtues on the other, because hope has this medio-passive structure that the other virtues don't. Now, then of course the question is, well, if hope is passive in this way, how do you get it, right? How does it come about in you? Well, the secular view would be, well, it's not infused by God, but it's still something you can't consciously acquire. But if you can't acquire it for yourself, how are you going to have it? Where's it coming from? And to that extent, that's why you might think that, again, the basic religious structure of hope being something infused by God makes a kind of sense, even in secularized terms. Okay. So just to sum all that up, what I've tried to do is look at hope as initially as a theological idea with a rich theological background, and I've been trying to ask in the spirit of Anscombe when she asks about moral obligation, what happens if we take that background away? What are we left with, and is what we're left with reasonably coherent? And I've tried to suggest that there are certainly issues, as it were, here for the secularist to confront. It's not entirely clear to me that the notion of hope does fully make sense outside a theological context. I haven't conclusively shown that. I don't even in my own mind know conclusively, what I think about it. But at least I hope I've drawn out some reasons to think that there's some sort of issues and complexity here. I don't think I'm as pessimistic as Anscombe that the whole idea is crazy and we should just forget it if we're going to move to a secular picture. But I do think, again, in a way, as you might expect, given that we're working with a concept that has, at least 2,000 years of theological baggage, if you like, that it's not so easy to just rip it out of a theological framework and secularize it. So that brings my talk then to a close. Thanks very much.